what we're discussing in this debate is how we tweak the welfare system to give more benefits to the poor, and we need a good safety net, but that's not going to help someone sustainably climb the income ladder and escape poverty. It's just a band-aid solution. And we need to discuss the bigger structural issues, how trade can drive more mobility, how entrepreneurship drives more mobility, how incentives in the price system drive entrepreneurship, innovation, market creating innovations that can drive more job creation. And that's one of the key issues about mobility that we haven't discussed a lot, either in Latin America or in developed countries as well.
Argentine presidential candidate Javier Milei has received global attention, not only for his eccentric style, but also his libertarian views. Milei has now reached the final two in the Argentinian presidential race, with promises to slash government spending and even potentially shut down the central bank. This potential political earthquake comes as many Latin American countries continue to struggle under the force of authoritarian, interventionist, or even socialist governments. Welcome back to the IEA podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh, and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Communications here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalizing policy question. Today's question: can Latin America overcome socialism? To discuss, I'm excited to be joined by not one, but two guests today. Gonzalo Schwarz, who is the President and CEO of the Archbridge Institute, which focuses on social mobility and human development. And I'm also joined by Dr. Axel Kaiser, who's a Chilean writer, lawyer, and political scientist. He's the co-founder and president of the think tank Foundation for Progress in Santiago. And he's also the author of The Street Economist, which we'll be talking a little bit about today as well. So I just want to start, before we get on to some of the more specific machinations in Latin politics today, a kind of broader thought about the state of Latin America. It seems like it's a region with so much opportunity. It's often talked about as time and time again as the next big economic growth area in the world, but often seems to at the same time struggle under these quite difficult political and economic situation. Gonzalo, I don't know if it comes to you first and think about your work maybe about social mobility and how that relates to Latin America.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. Yes, I think social mobility is a key issue. There's a lot of stagnation across different countries across the region, and what people many times relate the lack of social mobility is because there's a lot of inequality. Now, personally, I think that's a misleading correlation. It's just there's some barriers that I think affect both income inequality and mobility as well. And the history of Latin America has been one where we've had very weak rule of law and institutions, and that has driven a lot of some of these outcomes. So corruption breeds a lot of that income inequality, breeds some of that stagnation, crony capitalism as well. And I think that comes from over-regulation, from overburdensome barriers to entrepreneurship, to individual and economic freedom. And that, I think, has been historically what has happened throughout the region and has made so the pendulum oscillate from one side to the other. And people, in the case, as you mentioned at the beginning, of Argentina, that's under 13% monthly inflation. Or Venezuela has been a basket case for a while because of all these restrictions, all these barriers to entrepreneurship, to private initiative. And I think that a lot of that stagnates mobility. A lot of that creates a lot of despair in people that they can't project themselves into the future. They can't think about their lives and how they're going to climb up if they have so many barriers in their way. And that's, as I said, is coming from decades and decades of many different issues around corruption, barriers that I think Axel can speak a little bit more about.
So actually, you've done a lot of work on various Latin American countries, thinking about their histories and economies. It seems Argentina is a particularly shocking case in some ways, that a century ago it was probably one of the world's richest countries. Today, as Gonzalo's already said, it's facing this inflation crisis and has stagnated, if not relatively declined, for a very long period of time.
Yes, so interesting, because Hayek was asked the same question when he was in Latin America, and I think it was in the late 70s. And why is Latin America such a failure when you compare it to the United States, Canada, North America, basically? And he said, and I think this is a fundamental reason why it's so hard to achieve prosperity in our region. He said that we had imported the French tradition of liberalism, which is a rationalistic tradition which claims that government and centrally planned agent can solve all our problems. Whereas the Americans had imported the Anglo-Saxon tradition of freedom, and therefore you had a more market-friendlier or individual liberty-friendlier social order. And I think that's one of the main reasons that explains everything that Gonzalo was just describing. I actually wrote a paper about this some years ago, but there is an extra or another element. Our culture is mostly a Catholic culture. And within this Catholic framework, the Jesuits had a huge impact in everything in Latin America, on all institutions and the way we think, basically. And Jesuit worldview is basically completely opposed to individual freedom and opposed to capitalism and free markets. Why? Because in their view, you need to have community that where the members are part of a whole, and if you allow individual freedom, then the corpus of Christ, which is understood as this community, right, becomes corrupted. You are not experiencing the same that all of the members are experiencing, and so you become rich and you don't care about the rest, and there is no solidarity. And this worldview has been extremely influential in the history of Latin America, in politics, in law, in economics, and everything. And you see it in Pope Francis. Pope Francis is a Jesuit, he's Argentinian, and he claims that the problems of Latin America are caused by economic liberalism. And he says that, well, capitalism is, a poor system, that it has to be replaced, and he is a Peronist. And it reflects, I think his opinions reflect largely what cultural Latin America is all about. And so it's not like he's Pope or an Argentinian guy who thinks that, but it's also what large sectors of Latin America, even conservatives, think about the market. And this is the reason why I think we are doomed to fail.
Well, that's a very pessimistic premise. I mean, is it Gonzalo, do you have much, I suppose, hope in terms of overcoming some of those or rebuilding some of those institutional failures or institutional premises when it comes to that collectivist way of thinking? I mean, it seems like there are potentially at least some success stories in Latin America. Maybe Chile, for example, had recent issues, but has been, at least in recent decades, a relatively more prosperous South American country.
Yeah, and there were some great reforms there, but that's where I think the issue of social mobility kicks in. If we're better off than our past generations, if we're better off as we're growing, and that's where I think there were a lot of reforms that went against the better reforms at the beginning of or late 70s and 80s and 90s, and since the 2006 onwards, seem to be crept in reforms and barriers that were going back in terms of education, taxes, entrepreneurship, even the education system sometimes, and that sort of created a stagnation of mobility. And the issue is that when you're used to generation after generation, like it happened in Chile, to having more mobility, and that stagnates, people are starting to develop more of a zero-sum mindset. That's what we've had a lot of times in the history of Latin America. And because there haven't been improvements in the standard of living for a while, that sort of breeds more questions around the system, and we need someone different, so the left comes in again. And now we've seen that they haven't been able to find any answers as well. So then maybe the pendulum swings back in Chile to the right. In Argentina, we see all the angst about how the economy is doing. Now Milei is doing better, or the center-right has been doing better because there's been so much economic suffering. So, and there are some good examples in Uruguay, my native country, but that's been very slow. Uruguay, it's very slow in doing reforms, but there's better rule of law than other countries. So there are some highlights. I think in some ways, as more people realize that it's not a matter of left and right, it's about having good economics and having good reforms that are liberalizing the economy, going against what Pope Francis, I think, has been saying, or other leaders have been saying in the region. But historically, there's been a lot of confusion around markets and crony capitalism. People have attributed a lot of failures of reforms or markets to what is in essence crony capitalism. And it started with adopting that system that Axel mentioned, and a system in which people who were closer to the monarchy in the past or closer to power had special privileges. But that's more cronyism. Those are not markets. But that sort of bred a culture, an underappreciation of entrepreneurs in society, because in the past there was a lot of crony capitalism and now there's a lot of distrust of like, oh, if you make it in Latin America, oh, it's because you did something. Either you cheated the system, you're close to power. And I think slowly but surely there's a lot of more private initiative. There's a great human capital. When Latin Americans go to Europe, to go to the United States, they succeed because there's good human capital, and with the right institutions in place, people can prosper. But in Latin America, those are the same issues over and over again. There's no right institutions. There's still a lot of corruption, crony capitalism, because of bigger bureaucracies and barriers. But there is, I think, some hope that people are seeing that it's just about we need to get the economics right, and that it will happen.
I have to say, my heart does sink when you talk about a period of stagnation leading to zero-sum thinking, leading to poor policy making. I think you could almost argue that's been the experience in the UK for the last 5-10 years. It seems like you can get stuck on this sense in which the existing system isn't delivering very well, but the inability to correctly identify what the problem is. Axel, do you want to, you really lit up, of course, as someone who's Chilean, about that particular side of it, and run us through what's been the experience, because you've been quite involved with some of the policy responses to the protests and the change in government.
And I was the main face of the resistance on the public debate in Chile against the reforms that Michelle Bachelet introduced in her second term.
So run us through what were those reforms? What
was basically a colossal increase in corporate tax, like with no precedent in the country's history. It destroyed investment. Also dramatically damaging the voucher system that we had in education, public education. Labor laws that made the labor market more rigid and increased the cost of hiring people and firing people and so on. So when she came to power in 2014, she promised to get rid of neoliberalism. This is what I'm trying to explain. Latin American culture is not compatible with the ideals of the modern world. Not compatible with the ideals of the modern world, which is basically the idea of individualism. When you take a look at the Atlas ranking of economic mentality, Chile is one of the lowest in the world pro-capitalism. And so I actually predicted this was going to happen. I wrote books, and I became to be known like a sort of Nostradamus because I predicted all of this. And if people want to understand how ideology, because in the end it's not the economic policies, it's the ideology that drives the economic policy. And how that destroyed Chile, because Chile has been destroyed already, this is a fact. For 10 years we have grown only 0.6% per capita. It's game over for Chile. And I wrote a paper that was published by Cato Journal called The Fall of Chile. And I explained how the mentality of redistributionism, egalitarianism, led to economic reforms that in the end destroyed the foundations of prosperity. But because the left controlled the narrative in the country, then instead of blaming the same wrong ideas and policies, people doubled down on that. And then more reforms came. And then you had this vicious circle in which we destroyed the country. Now there is some reaction, but I don't think we are going to recover it for many, many years or maybe decades. And that's why I'm so skeptical, because when you have countries that make the necessary reforms to prosper in Latin America, it can work for 1-2 decades and then they destroy them again. It's what happened with us in 1975. When the Fraser Institute started publishing the Economic Freedom Index, Venezuela was number 13 in the world. 13. Chile, until recently, was number 13. We are now number 30. And if you take a look at the evolution of Venezuela, it was not like they were number 13 and then Chavez came and destroyed everything. As they were falling. And when Chavez came to power, it was like 80-something already. And then Chavez ended up destroying everything in Maduro. And so that is the challenge that we face. We have to change structurally our mentality, our culture, so that people embrace the ideals of the free market and individual liberty, human flourishing. Otherwise, we can have good reforms, but then another government will come and will destroy them, and then we will go back to the same place.
Yeah, I mean, this is almost a classic idea that culture is upstream of economics. And this is almost the purpose of a think tank, which is to say it's slightly less, day-to-day policy making is very important, but also even more important is the general understanding of economic issues that lead to that. I suppose on a more positive, optimistic note, potentially is the rise of Milei in Argentina. I think that there'll be a bit of a temptation in some of the English language press to basically paint him as some kind of populist madman, maybe like a Trumpite or something along those lines. I'm wondering, where is he placed politically compared to some of those other figures in Latin America or Western politics? And what is the potential there?
Well, I'm a personal friend of Javier Milei. I've known him for a long time. Actually, it's funny because when he started to become famous, people were saying that Javier Milei was the Axel Kaiser of Argentina. And now they are all asking me if I'm the Javier Milei of Chile. So he presented actually my book, The Street Economist in Argentina. It became very influential in the free market movement there. And first of all, he has achieved something that is heroic, which is to change in a country like Argentina with the Peronist culture, which is statism collectivist like no other country in the world probably. Structurally, he changed public opinion. It means that the new generations that follow him are not going to be Peronist. They are going to be pro-market, libertarians, classical liberals, and that changed forever, in my opinion. And that had never happened before in the history of Argentina, or probably in the history of Latin America. So he achieved something extraordinary. Some of us helped, but he's the main figure there. Now, compared to Bolsonaro, Trump, he's different. He's basically someone who truly believes in the institutions. He would never mess with the institutions. He is a Democrat. He believes in liberal democracy or classical liberal democracy. And he is someone who has shown also a pragmatism. Now that he didn't win in the first round, he has come together with the former rivals from Juntos por el Cambio, which was the Patricia Bullrich, the other center-right wing candidate that was running. And he has said that I'm starting from a clean slate, so let's come all together. And this is something that most people I used to talk with were saying, no, he's never going to do that because he's insane. He's not insane. I know him. He's extremely smart and pragmatic, and also if he has to be. But he's also principle driven. He's not going to just be a president that doesn't do anything and like Macri and just try to get through the 4 years. He actually can't afford to do that because they are on the verge of hyperinflation now in Argentina. So I think people are misjudging him, and there is a reaction from the media against him because he is going to be, if he wins, the first libertarian candidate ever to win a presidential election in modern times in the Western world. And so journalists don't really like pro-capitalists, hardcore pro-capitalists. Compared to him, Ronald Reagan is like Karl Marx. Yeah, so it's really impressive that he has this chance of winning, and I would say that he will have a good ride as a president if he wins.
Do you think there's a risk potentially that of basically trying to go too far too quickly and it being quite chaotic? I mean, in terms of cutting, even philosophically, cutting back a substantial amount of government spending is something a lot of classical liberals have talked about and advocated for. Is it something that he'll, I suppose, be able to achieve politically? And is there I suppose a lot of thought about, and this is where I think there's a lot of struggle, is how to get from A to B, what kind of reforms you'll need to do to get to the end point, rather of, I suppose, a smaller government and more entrepreneurship and social mobility.
Yeah, and well, one of the things that he won't be, he can do some executive orders or functions, but he doesn't have a majority in Congress too much to do a lot of big things. He can do some things himself. I think, as Axel mentioned, he'll moderate himself now with trying to build a bigger coalition. But at the end of the day, Argentina needs that change, regardless if it was him, if it's someone else. And I think he's the one that has the better chance of doing it. If Patricia Bullrich would have won, I mean, I'm not an expert on her program or others, but it didn't give me a sense that she would be making those changes, and that her party, that was in power before the current Peronist government, was able to do anything. So it's kind of it's very complicated. There was a Nobel laureate in economics, Simon Kuznets, that said that there's 4 types of countries in the world: developed, underdeveloped, Argentina, and Japan. Because Argentina is always such a weird case that it has, as you said, they have a lot of natural resources, human capital, a lot, and they're always struggling. And what I think brought me to thinking about that quote again this week was, even though he did well and Patricia Bullrich, with both of their votes, they could win, the center-right could win, but there were still 35% who voted for Massa, who is the current Minister of Economics, who is a big part to blame for the 13% monthly inflation. So it's a complicated case, but for Argentina, but he would be the one that I think would be, maybe he doesn't go all the way in doing all the reforms that he said. He is trying to sort of cater to the base in this first round, and he may be moderating himself, but Argentina needs those changes. It's been too many years, too many missed opportunities, and they need to do it. And I think that he's just has more of that maybe grit, more of the perseverance to see a lot of this stuff happen. I think he will be slower than what he's saying, and he doesn't have the majority in Congress. So
on one of his key policies, I believe, is dollarization, which seems like, for all the critiques of the Federal Reserve, it's not allowing inflation to get quite out of control compared to Argentina. Is that something that is, I suppose, a viable policy in practice in Argentina? Is that likely to happen?
So Argentina has over $200 billion in cash under the mattress. The Argentinian economy is already dollarized. I mean, everyone who can afford to buy dollars has dollars. You buy properties, you buy it in dollars, in cash. You bring the whole
it's
package
like
of
Venezuela as well, isn't it? Like an underground.
It's happening the same thing, because hyperinflation completely destroyed the Bolivar in Venezuela, and in Argentina it's on the verge of hyperinflation, and everyone thinks in terms of dollars. When you go and you buy something at the store, even the guy who has an average salary is thinking, how many dollars are this? I mean, how much money is this in dollars? Because inflation is so dramatic that you don't have prices, more or less, stable prices anymore. And so this is the first thing. So you could just do it like El Salvador did it with saying the dollar is from now on legal tender, and that would change a lot, because dollar will start circulating and you will have an organic process of replacement of the currency. But then you have the problem of the debt of the central bank and the public debt. And the big question is how you get the dollars you need in order to pay off these debts and to dollarize bank deposits and that. And that's the main challenge. But there are some ideas that they already have, and there are, I know, having conversations with other important institutions in the U.S. and other parts of the world to get this done. And if they have the political support of their partners from Juntos por el Cambio, that would make a big difference. And also if there is political support from Congress, because I think they will need laws in order to make all of this happen. But, they don't have a choice. It's not like, oh no, we are going to stay with the peso. Dollarization, in my view, is going to come to Argentina in a disordered way, or, like in an institutionalized way, because people don't want the peso anymore. When I went to Argentina, so that your viewers know, have a sense of the proportion of the problem. 2015-16, it was like 15 peso per dollar. Now it's over 1,000 pesos per dollar. This is spiraling out of control, and it's really going to be much worse in a year from now. So I don't think they have a lot of time. I think they will have 3-4 months in order to announce, because you in Argentina, you are voted into office in order to control inflation. That was Menem, for instance. and in many cases before him. If they don't do it, if they don't start from day one trying to solve the problem with aggressive reforms, then they will lose their honeymoon political capital.
Yeah.
So just pulling back to these kind of broader issues again, Axel, I wanted if you could give us a bit of an intro to your book, The Street Economist. Talk us through how far it's reached already, and then I'm kind of interested in some of the lessons from it as well.
Yes, thank you. So I wrote this book. It's a very basic introduction to economics. It was published first in Chile, and we sold over 40,000 copies in a year. It was number one for over a year, and it's still being sold in many bookstores and countries. 7 languages already. Yeah. And the content is basically, I try to explain price theory, capital theory, free trade theory, entrepreneurship, and things like that in a few pages with no math, no graphs, no footnotes, in a very simple language. And I think that has been the key to the success, unprecedented, of the book.
So if you want a glowing endorsement, Deirdre McCloskey, who's also done an interview in this room, said, if you read only one book on economics, it should be Alex Kaiser's. It will change your mind and maybe your life, certainly your politics. So it's headline is 15 lessons. I don't know if we quite can get through all 15, although I would obviously encourage people to read it. But in what you think some of the key lessons are, what would you say that maybe top 2 or 3 lessons if you had to pick?
Well, I started with a very basic lesson that we have forgotten in the West, all over the West, which is that in order to live, you have to work. You have to earn something. And that there are 2 ways of living. You work from your own work, or you live out of the work of others. And so you expect the government to take away from others to give it to you. So I start with that very simple lesson, and then I go down and I explain, for instance, what prices are. That prices enable to transmit information in a market economy. I use very simple examples, right? And so that people can understand. This is Hayekian insight into price theory. And that you shouldn't fix prices, you shouldn't mess with prices because you alter the signals that allow to structure the whole economy, and then you end up harming the poor people and people with no opportunities even more. Then I explain, for instance, why free trade is so important. And I also use very simple examples, like how you can profit from free trade by exchanging what you produce as a, let's say, Latin American country with the technology that Britain is capable of producing. So in the end, what we do with free trade is to, as Chile or Argentina or whatever, or any other country, is to profit from the brain power that you can find in London, for instance. Like you have great engineers, they invent things, and we can import these things. It's as if they were living in our own country, only we produce wine or wheat or whatever, we send it here, and then that's the way that we all prosper. And now we are going back to protectionist policies, not only in Latin America, which is typical for us, but also you are seeing at the level of the European Union, the United States. I understand that there is a Cold War 2.0 context here with China, and that we shouldn't forget how important free trade is for our economies. And things like capital. What is capital? We tend to demonize capital. And I explain that capital is savings and ingenuity, applied ingenuity, basically. That if you have a computer or you have a machine, whatever, that's capital. Well, in order to develop this machine that allows you to increase, your crops production or something like that, you need savings that will pay for your for the time you need to be alive, in order to develop this machine. And in the end, you will increase production, and therefore you will benefit everyone else, because then the price of bread will dramatically, sink, and in the end, the consumers and the real wages of everyone is going up. And these things I explain in a very, very simple language, and I think that's the key of the success of the book. And it's also the pirate edition is being sold on many streets in Latin America, which is the best way of knowing that you have really achieved a book that is having an effect, a mainstream.
Going viral, yeah.
Yeah.
So I wonder what your reflections are on the book, and any final thoughts about this this relationship with social mobility, which is really you've done some great research on recently as well.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of the lessons that Axel discusses are key. And I think that the social mobility discussion has focused too much on income inequality, which doesn't tell you much about anything that's going on. It's just a gap between the rich and the poor. It doesn't tell you what's creating that gap. And I think a lot of the lessons that Axel talks about in the book highlight how the market system works, the price system works, and we need to have a lot of more classical liberal ideas. We need to study more how entrepreneurship relates to social mobility. As Axel mentioned, one of that we forgot in the Western countries that we need to work. We need to work in order to generate income. And the main way to climb the income ladder, the main way that we have our source of income is through a job. But now what we're discussing in this debate is how can we tweak the welfare system to give more benefits to the poor, and we need a good safety net, but that's not going to help someone sustainably climb the income ladder and escape poverty. It's just a band-aid solution, and we need to discuss the bigger structural issues, how trade can drive more mobility, how entrepreneurship drives more mobility, how incentives in the price system drive entrepreneurship, innovation, market creating innovations that can drive more job creation. And that's one of the key issues about mobility that we haven't discussed a lot, either in Latin America or in developed countries as well.
And I think I looked at your research when I was preparing for this podcast about just the correlation between economic freedom and people being able to be entrepreneurial and social mobility, which I think is really essential here, which is you don't get people moving between different classes if you limit their capacity to start up a business or earn income or work their way up. If you just do it through a redistributive high tax system, everyone's going to be perhaps a little bit more equal, but equally poor with relatively little mobility to move between those income levels.
Yeah, exactly. And if you put more barriers to business and you reduce that amount of job creation, there's going to be less paths to flourishing, less paths for more social mobility. And we think about it, and when we put taxes on a company, we think that's going to help to redistribute, but then you're creating more barriers for people to create new jobs. And at the end of the day, that benefits sometimes the upper class more. So it creates inequalities because they can pay those taxes. They can afford to sustain more regulations and barriers because that sort of drives out competition. And if we don't have competition, we'll generate more barriers to mobility and we'll generate even more inequality. So all those things are related. So at the end of the day, we need more economic freedom to drive more mobility and even less inequality.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps even I think probably the biggest example in the UK, which we go back to time and time again, which is something like housing, where we've regulated it to such an extent and made it so expensive to live your day-to-day life that you in a sense prevent people from being able to move and live where they could be most productive and they could get the best job. So you're locking people out of cities or making them pay most of any additional income they get by living in a city. And as a result, you have less social mobility. It's not that kind of social mobility isn't really talked about, like the impact of housing on social mobility, but it's those kind of barriers that we see also all over the place, which are hugely problematic. But I think on that fascinating note, I just want to thank you both, Gonzalo and Axel, for joining the IEA podcast. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion on a wide range of issues. If you are enjoying the podcast, please do subscribe on your chosen podcast provider. And if you'd like to learn more about the IEA's work, just visit iea.org.uk.